Let us turn now to the place that war occupies in culture. The historian John Keegan has noted that war is always an expression of culture, often a determinant of cultural forms, and in some societies the culture itself. And it's certainly true that we can find everywhere the lasting mark of war in the culture that surrounds us. War is commonly depicted in our art, our media, our films, and our games. Cities are littered with monuments, statues, and place names that commemorate wars, battles, soldiers, and military leaders. The City of London, for instance, is covered in such monuments that are being dedicated to any number of participants in these conflicts. There is even today, of course, a monument in Park Lane to the war animals. Our museums, similarly, are full of art depicting battles and experience of war. War has long been a privileged subject, a privileged topic for artistic representation, whether it's for the glorification of particular regimes or to draw attention to the heroism of particular actors or the traumas of war. Our films, the cinematographic art, the art form of the 20th century, has also made war into one of its privileged subjects. You might think of particularly the role of the representation of Vietnam in film as being very significant, in the sense that Vietnam has become the archetypal cinematographic war. It's impossible for most of us to think of Vietnam without evoking images from those famous war films. War is also doesn't always, of course, have to be represented in a realistic or historically faithful manner. War can be represented in a fantastical, mythical space. Think of how much of our narratives, the stories we tell, however removed from our present, are mediated through this idea of war. Such famous franchises as Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings are structured around the idea of conflict, which speaks to some very elemental ideas of narration and storytelling in our minds and our cultures. Finally, we find war embodied, represented in our play. Weapons are commonly recreated in the forms of toys, whether it be toy soldiers, replica weapons. Again, these weapons might be realistic, might be modeled on existing weapons, or fantastical, space guns and so forth. And video games, of course, as an art form, perhaps the art form of the 21st century, is one that has made great use of war and military dynamics within it. Again, both in explicit historical, realistic settings and in much more fantastical ones. To the point that even the US military has released its own game used for recruitment, and the military has become very keen on, in fact, recruiting gamers and making sure that they can draw on those talents and on a group of individuals, players, who are, through their consumption of interactive media, already playing war. But war is also omnipresent in the language and in the imagery that we use when we discourse about things as diverse as politics, business, or sport. We speak commonly of metaphorical weapons and ammunitions, of being on the offense or the defense, of political battlegrounds, of being on the media front line, of being under fire, of government officials closing ranks, of news having the effects of a bombshell, of being bombarded with questions, of conquering new markets, of guerrilla marketing, of being caught in no man's land. We declare metaphorical wars on drugs, poverty, cancer, or global warming. Some peace activists even call for a war against war. We could multiply these examples. There's no shortage of war metaphors in our language. And the reason why they persist is because they're very powerful rhetorical devices. They serve to indicate an urgency of threat or resolve. If you want to mobilize resources for any struggle, for any cause, then you call it a war, however metaphorical that war might be. At the same time, contemporary Western society's attitude to war is certainly much more ambiguous than a straightforward celebration of it, and in that sense breaks in significant ways with the prevalent attitudes of past centuries. For one, we could note that despite the constant disagreements, and certainly we live in a time of discord on the European continent, European societies can no longer seriously envisage going to war against each other. That might seem like a banality today, but if we take a moment to reflect, we might see how historically unusual this is. Throughout hundreds, if not thousands of years of European history, the continent was at war. The expectation was that in anyone's lifetime, conflict could erupt and would erupt. Political disagreements today in the European continent do not seem likely to be resolved through force as things stand today. Similarly, the pursuit of war as an inalienable right of state sovereignty has been systematically disavowed. It used to be, not so long ago, that states considered that going to war was part of their sovereign right. This is what to be a state was to be able to wage war in a self-interested, instrumental fashion. No longer. War has effectively, in terms of international law, been rendered illegal. And states seek to use other language than the more bellicist tones that we might have heard earlier in the last century. For instance, we used to have ministries of war. We now all have ministries of defense, regardless of how far force is projected. Similarly, our professional armed forces have come to define themselves as keepers of the peace. Here we see a member of the Strategic Air Command, the organization within the US military dedicated to planning for nuclear war during the Cold War. That is to say that the entire purpose was to have the means to devastate the Soviet Union and its allies with nuclear weaponry at the touch of a button. And this organization's motto is "Peace is our profession." All this military preparation is not ultimately for the purpose of war, but for peace. We've also observed in Western countries the end of conscription. It is no longer the case that all men of fighting age are to be brought into the military, whether it's for military service or whether for an actual conflict. Today we have entirely professional militaries made of voluntary conscripts or voluntary soldiers, and therefore a very small proportion of the population has direct experience of war or even being in the military. Attitudes to traditional military values have also markedly changed. Ancestral martial values of submission to authority and warring prowess, values that were valorized for centuries in our art and culture, are treated by much of civil society as suspect. The rigidities and unquestioning obedience traditionally associated with military institutions is one commonly treated with scorn and derision. Military institutions are expected to treat their soldiers with much more courtesy and respect, and the habitual kind of customary vision of a highly disciplined army of men being shouted at orders by drill sergeants is one that doesn't sit comfortably with modern sensibilities. And it's certainly no longer acceptable among polite company to claim finding fulfillment in the killing of other humans. Indeed, we could go further and say that, in fact, one of the things that has happened is that civilian norms have become increasingly imposed on the military. So we might have lived in the 20th century in a period where concern was over the militarization of civil society, the ways in which the values of the military might be seen to be predominant and to come to exert themselves across entire societies. I think, for instance, of the fascist model of society, which imagines the nation in arms and every aspect of society to be regimented as if in war. But rather, on the opposite, we can look at contemporary military organizations as institutions that have over time been expected to adapt to civilian norms that were not inherent to them. This is embodied perhaps most notably in the progressive extension of norms of tolerance and openness in the recruitment of forces. So, for example, the access to women within the military, it's today the case in the United States and in the UK, that all fighting roles are now open to women. Any woman who can pass the rigors of the physical tests can access these positions. Similarly, the position of the military on homosexuality or gender status, transsexualism, and so on has also changed markedly. Again, these have come mostly through pressure from civil society on the military. Another marked trend is the ways in which statues, conventional statues that were erected for military leaders, are no longer to be found. Here on the left we have two statues that can be found in London. On the left we have Admiral Nelson on Trafalgar Square, who thrones over Trafalgar Square, celebrated of course as the victor of that battle. And on the right we have Arthur Harris, known as Bomber Harris, who rests at the Aldwych next to the Air Force Chapel. The statue of Harris is a controversial one because Harris is held to be responsible for leading the strategic bombing campaign that devastated German cities, and many are not comfortable with this commemoration of this figure. Whatever the rights and wrongs of this particular statue, it's certainly true that we no longer see such figures being remembered and being erected as statues in our cities. Our commemorations focus predominantly on the anonymous, on the common man or common woman, the victims of war, not those who gave their lives, not those who led them. Similarly, places are no longer named after victorious battles. For instance, the Battle of Trafalgar. You will not find anywhere in the world a Fallujah Square. This is further reflected in the form of our commemorations, which have become much more somber and impersonal. Again, it's a sacrifice of the common soldier that's put forward, rather than the glorification of great combatants or great war leaders. Think of the particular significance of the unknown soldier here. And historical memory is similarly informed. The First World War, and to a lesser extent the Second World War, certainly in the UK, is viewed as a European tragedy, not a national triumph. We have cycles of commemoration that really focus on sacrifice and suffering, not on glorification, not on national glory and national triumph. Similarly, our art no longer celebrates or glorifies war. Much more commonly, it depicts the inhumanities and suffering of war. Here on the left we have one of the most famous paintings of the 20th century, maybe the most famous war painting of all, Pablo Picasso's Guernica, which represents the destruction of the village of Guernica in 1937 by the Luftwaffe in the context of the Spanish Civil War. Picasso wanted to capture, and did capture, in a powerful tapestry image, the suffering and the martyrdom of that village. A tapestry copy of this painting can be found in the UN headquarters in New York, in front of the entrance of the Security Council. So when the great and the good walk into the Security Council to decide on the matters of war and peace in the world today, they are confronted with this stark reminder of the consequences of war. So one of the peculiar paradoxes of our age is that while both the historical experience and current exercise of armed force is interwoven into our societies in all sorts of ways that I've outlined to you, that war still exerts a powerful hold over our imaginations, we are at the same time perhaps more ambivalent than ever about its role. And so this module is an invitation for us to grapple with the profound ambiguity surrounding the place of war in our world and our self-understanding. It starts with the recognition that war creates as much as it destroys. And if all creation is simultaneously an act of destruction, it is perhaps unsurprising that war should be such a crucible of personal and collective transformation. For the same reason, war is simultaneously experienced as absurd and as a profound source of meaning.